Truly, the devil would not have been able to do much at all in the church if an anti-church had not already been in place.
The gravedigger of tradition, Paul VI. More than a century has gone by since the Carbonari, the Italian Freemasons, first laid plans to undermine the papacy. The work which we are going to undertake is not the labor of a day, nor of a month, nor of a year. It may last several years, perhaps a century. Yet, within our ranks, the soldier dies, but the battle continues. What we must seek and await, as the Jews await the Messiah, is a pope who suits our needs. And this pontiff, like most of his contemporaries, will necessarily have more or less imbibed the humanitarian principles which we are going to begin circulating. You wish to establish the reign of the elect upon the throne of the whore of Babylon, and see the clergy march behind your banner, always believing it is marching behind the banner of the apostolic keys. Throw out your nets, deep into the sacristies, the seminaries, the convents. You will have preached a revolution in tiara and cope, marching with the cross and the banner, a revolution which will only need a little directing in order to set fire to the four corners of the earth. When not being described as a revolutionary in tiara and cope, Paul VI has been compared to Moses, guiding the chosen people out of Egypt toward the unknown promised land. He has often been presented, as well, as a modern-day Hamlet, who somehow found himself on the throne of Peter. His indecisive temperament may have had its origin in a lack of solid intellectual formation, since Giovanni Battista Montini, who lived from 1897 to 1978, never went to the seminary, a reality made all the more regrettable by the fact that his father, a man of influence, was editor of a libertarian review. Hence a certain juvenile utopianism. We can collaborate with the left, but not with the right. These gaps in his formation were only accentuated by his tendency to let imagination dominate over reality. I am convinced that one of my thoughts, a thought from my own soul, is worth more to me than anything in the world. His friend, Jean Guiton, describes him well. He represented the modern man, which is remarkable in itself for a pope, intended as a guide and a leader of humanity, is not charged with the task of resembling the men of his time, especially not the utterly disconcerted specimen who is a modern man. This pope was not content merely to think as we do, which is an easy exercise of the mind, but he felt, he worried, he suffered as we do. Paul VI bore in his nature a resemblance to the men of his time, in his aspirations as in his torments. With such a mentality, this unwitting liberal had but one ambition: to gather into one all peoples and all churches. It was an ambition to which he was prepared to sacrifice everything. It was he who discreetly fomented Modernism in the Vatican of Pius XII, in the shadow of his protector, John XXIII. However, he should be known above all as the Pope who undertook the systematic application of conciliar iconoclasm. Number 1. His friends. Tell me who your friends are, and I will tell you who you are. This proverb holds the key to an understanding of this contradictory, anxious character, who served as a substitute Secretary of State under Pius XII. He was a great admirer of modernism, and the only priest who dared to attend the gatherings and discussions held at the home of Count Gallerati Scotti, twice condemned by the Holy Office. He was reportedly an admirer of the philosophies of action, popularized in France by La Bretagne, Blondel, and Leroy. His flirtation with modernism is confirmed by his confidant, Jean Guiton. September 8th, 1969. The Pope sings the praises of Father de Lubac. He boasts of his intellect and of the solidity and the breadth of his documentation. He is astonished to see him treated by some as outdated. April 29th, 1974. The Pope tells me of his great esteem for the modern theologians. He cites Manaranch, de Lubac, to whom he gives first prize, Congar Ronner, whom he says is not a very clear thinker, and Cardinal Journet, whom he finds a bit too scholastic. He sheltered Blondel. Your trilogy on philosophy and the Christian mind has proven itself a monument of lofty and beneficial apologetics. And how could your filial homage to His Holiness not have been pleasing to him? Your philosophical speculations, therefore, all of which represent the transcendence of the revealed deposit of faith, are nonetheless consistently fruitful in their application to the mysteries of the faith as a whole. In the name of Pius XII, Montini thus approved Blondel's entire opus, which the same Pope would condemn only a short time later in Humani Generis. The substitute Secretary of State was finally distanced from the Curia in the last years of Pacelli's pontificate, on account of a certain independence of judgment, as well as Montini's tardiness in reporting certain facts to the Pope, in the hope that tensions would ease over time. He was dismissed also for having established contact with Stalin during the Second World War, against the explicit orders of the Pope. In 1954, in a secret report from the Archbishop of Riga, imprisoned by the Soviets, Pius XII was informed that a high personality of the Secretariat of State had been in contact with the persecutors in the name of the Pope. His bitterness was so great as to affect his health, and he felt obliged henceforth to direct the external affairs of the Vatican, unassisted by a Secretary of State. The treason appeared in still greater relief when Humani Generis was published, in which Pius XII condemned with vigor the modernist deviations of the time. He had commanded the bishops and superior generals, under pain of grave sin, to keep diligent watch that such opinions not be spread in schools or in meetings and conferences. Montini proceeded, under the Pope's nose, to confide in his friend Jean Guiton that the errors condemned were but ways of thinking, which could lead into error, but which in themselves remain perfectly respectable. Moreover, there are 3 reasons for which the encyclical will not be deformed. The first, I can tell you between us, is the explicit will of the Holy Father. The second is the mentality of the French episcopacy, which is so open-minded, so welcoming of contemporary currents of thought. I come to my third reason. It is a short one. The French are intelligent. Once again, Pius XII was made aware of the treason, and took disciplinary measures against Montini, distancing him from Rome by naming him Archbishop of Milan, promoveatur ut amoveatur. He refused him the red hat of the cardinal, and never accepted to receive him in audience, while de Lubac dodged thunderbolts from the Holy Office, and saw his books denounced. From Milan there came to him words of adhesion and encouragement. Montini was made a cardinal by his friend Jean the 23rd, opening for him the path to the papacy, which Pius XII had intentionally blocked. Once elected pope, Montini was able to wield the supreme authority in service of the forces of modernism. To an even greater extent than John the 23rd, he opened the doors of the council to the new theologians. Their number went from 201 in September 1962 to 480 at the end of the council, thanks to the discreet influence of Paul VI, showing them his approval by receiving them in private audiences, concelebrating with them and praising their collaboration. He exercised the same discreet influence over the Council Fathers, subtly urging them to ratify the new theology condemned such a short time before by Pius XII. Cardinal Danilou defined Paul VI as a liberal pope. This was not so much because he was compromising and undecided, but, on the contrary, avid to defend liberal ideas. Paul VI knew what he wanted and used discretion in order to sidestep the foreseeable reactions of the recalcitrant, as Bugnini bore witness. In reality, he guided the bark of Peter with a methodic and tenacious firmness, belying an equally tenacious legend, on a straight and steady course toward ecumenical modernism. Thus he brought into line Father Charles Boyer, rector of the Gregorian University, obliging him to rehabilitate both de Lubac and Teilhard de Chardin, by forcing him to invite de Lubac to a Thomistic Congress. The Pope was equally firm in breaking the resistance of the exegetes by reinstating certain professors of the Biblical Institute, a den of modernism under the influence of the nefarious Cardinal Tisserant. Zurich and Lyonnais, the very men who had been expelled by the Holy Office in 1961, triumphantly reassumed their chairs of Holy Scripture in the heart of Rome thanks to Paul VI. Yet these professors had not cast off their errors. The denial of the messianic prophecy of Isaiah 7:14, "Behold, a virgin will conceive and will bear a child." The refusal to consider Romans 5:12 as pointing to original sin, as defined by the Council of Trent. The denial of the primacy of Peter in Matthew 16:17-19. "Blessed are you, Simon." Congar accurately described Paul VI as speaking to the right and acting to the left. Paul VI effectively packed the court of the Biblical Commission by the addition of new, enlightened members who introduced Bultmann's Formgeschichte. The Pope brought the same modernist bias to his judgment of Hans Küng, his comrade in arms at the council. In fact, the condemnation of Küng was perfectly benign since he was allowed to continue teaching. On the other hand, when Archbishop Lefebvre decided to form his seminarians of Ecône according to Catholic tradition, he received notice of suspension ad divinis, and the order to disband his society and close the seminary within 30 days. His crime? He was anti-modernist. Paul VI, ever clement for those of the left, revived the Inquisition and its condemnations for the benefit of the fundamentalists. How true it is that no one is more sectarian than a liberal. Paul VI was an ardent promoter of ecumenism, following in the footsteps of his protector, John XXIII. With Cardinal Bea, Frings, and Leinart for faithful lieutenants, he considered it his duty to bring a new kind of universality to the Church, in order to render it acceptable to the modern world such as it is, with its false philosophy, social principles, and religions. All of these men seem to have suffered from an excessive fear of any taint of superiority or exclusivity. They were afraid to be the salt of the earth and the light of the world, because it would mean opposition to the world. Their false humility led them to reject the pride and treasure of Catholics, the fact of belonging to the true religion, the only religion on earth to defend the 10 Commandments, the only one to defend its principles in a reasonable and logical way, the only one to satisfy the human conscience by its sanctity and its charity. No! All of that must disappear. The mirage of the union of mankind and his faith in man, believer or non-believer, was an obsession for the spiritual leader of humanity, moving him even to sacrifice his role as vicar of Christ. He abandoned the primacy of divine truth and the primacy of the Pope. He was thus able to ignore the primacy of Jesus Christ and of his Church. Number 2. Abandonment of the primacy of the faith. The principal abandonment was certainly that of the primacy of the truth and of the truths of the faith. The abdication of authority was painfully manifest in the Dutch Catechism, better named the Catechism of Heresies, for its denials of angels, the priesthood, the incarnation, and the real presence. Rome allowed its publication and dissemination throughout the world on condition that it include the Roman condemnation as an appendix. This grave dereliction of the duty to protect the faith was not an isolated incident. The Catechism of the French bishops, Pierre Vivantes, living stones, was published surreptitiously before receiving Rome's approval. Cardinal Ratzinger at first decried the indigence of the new catechism and the degradation of this catechism riddled with heresies. He was met with an uproar on the part of the episcopacy and immediately withdrew his criticism, insisting that he had only meant to address the catechetical situation in general and not condemn the catechetical work in France. The French bishops were free to toast their victory. In reality, revolutionary teachings had undermined the universities and seminaries well before infiltrating the catechism. Cardinal de Courtrai once admitted that, in the 1950s and 1960s, openness and dialogue were already watchwords in the Church, and particularly in France. University professors were also being swept off their feet by the wave of new methods and ideologies, including the cult of secularism. Group therapy was the rage, hand in hand with the study of modern systems of information, ranging anywhere from unbridled freedom of expression to methods of thought control. Brainwashing was coming into its own, all the more so given the immense popularity of Teilhard de Chardin in seminaries and lodges alike. Should we be surprised to see clergy and professors losing the most essential of bearings, their Catholic faith? Fearing lest their sabotage of teaching institutions had not achieved its full effect, the modernists decided to attack the Holy Bible itself by placing in the hands of believers a Bible in harmony with their own oft-condemned fantasies. This was the reasoning behind the new ecumenical Bible. Could an ecumenical Bible be anything other than a fraudulent translation, with a commentary infected with indifferentism? It is not difficult to imagine the passages judged too Catholic being cleverly swept under the table. The word of God had to bend before the fiat of the separated brethren. God and his word are rather troublesome at times. Such publications were free to roam and deny the doctrines of the Church in all impunity, since the Pope had suppressed the Index in 1965 and paralyzed the Holy Office, following to the letter the modernist agenda, which had called for the weakening of authority by the reform of the Roman congregations, particularly the Holy Office and the Index. Gone are the days of condemnation and judiciary procedure. Modern man has come into his own and is sufficiently adult to judge for himself. Henceforth, the Pope pledged never again to condemn anyone at all. The faithful would follow the way of the Church more fully and out of love if the content of the faith and the nature of morals were simply laid out before them. Likewise, the Holy Office, henceforth renamed the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, found itself legally paralyzed before even the most glaring cases of heresy, since the secret inquisitorial procedure had been outlawed. The congregation had to use the ordinary judicial procedure, which effectively prevented its reaching a final decision. All the more so when the incriminated had the favor of powerful protectors. This is the reason why, since 1968, so few condemnations have been issued against heretical works, which proliferate with impunity. Such was the case with Hans Küng, supported by the Swiss and German bishops. Such was the case with Father Léon Xavier Dufour, professor of exegesis at Fourvière, who denied the resurrection of Christ and found shelter behind his Jesuit brothers. This state of affairs reduces by half the activity of the papacy, since its goal is not only to propagate the deposit of faith, but also to defend it against the attacks of the enemy. What use is an army when the enemy knows he has no defense? Number 3. Abandonment of the primacy of the Pope. Along with the primacy of the faith, the primacy of the Pope has been the object of repeated attacks since the close of the Council. In reality, the first anti-papist was the Pope himself. As early as 1967, he complained of the primacy of the Pope as an obstacle to ecumenism. His conviction passed quickly into action as he relinquished his power as a vicar of Christ. The Pope had a headlong collision with the bishops' conferences over the publication of Humanae Vitae. The Pope appointed a commission to consider the lawfulness of the pill, giving it 2 years to decide, as though the Church had not definitively ruled on the question long ago. Certain American bishops took advantage of the delay to encourage the use of contraceptives. The encyclical finally appeared in 1968 to put an end to all discussion. This act reaffirmed the authority of the Pope over and above all opposition. No believer could deny the competence of the teaching authority of the Church in interpreting the natural law. Humanae Vitae became, by the very fact, the most important act of Paul VI's pontificate, for he had acted against the advice of the Commission of Theologians and against the signs of the times, putting himself at odds with no less than 12 dissenting bishops' conferences. The principle of collegiality, or co-responsibility, theoretically gave every bishop the right to judge anything and everything, including papal decisions. The French episcopacy, with the Dutch and the Canadians right behind, gave its own version of Humanae Vitae. It claimed that, in case of conflicting duties, the individual conscience could decide before God which duty was more important under the circumstances, and that one might be dispensed from more obligations if faced with humanly insupportable circumstances. Their presentation betrayed a twisted exegesis, in flagrant opposition to the encyclical itself, which declared in no uncertain terms that an intrinsically evil act was never licit. This sole act of authority on the part of the Pope and the storm of protest to which it gave rise around the world were so painful to him that he swore it would never happen again. The abscess of papal abdication was opened with the Pastoral Council of Holland, which brought together a large number of the faithful in the presence of the bishops. 90% of the participants voted for the abolition of priestly celibacy, the use of laicized priests at the heads of parishes, the ordination of women, the right of bishops to a deciding voice in papal decrees. The Pope's response to this assembly is typical of the pontificate of Paul VI. The eye sees the damage, but the hand does not go to the root of the problem. The Pope admitted that certain doctrinal propositions accepted by the bishops left him perplexed and seemed worthy of serious reservations. He declared himself profoundly moved to see Vatican II, so rarely cited, and to see the acceptance of propositions so out of harmony with conciliar and papal rulings. Finally, even though the bishops were in connivance, rather than asking them to reaffirm the faith on the disputed questions, Paul VI continued, "The awareness of our responsibility as pastor of the Universal Church obliges us to ask you in all frankness, what do you think we can do to help you, to strengthen your authority, to enable you to overcome the better present difficulties of the Church in Holland?" This white flag before the Dutch offensive marked the complete abdication of papal authority, so much so that, On June 22nd, 1972, the Pope confessed openly, "Perhaps the Lord called me to this service, not because I was particularly apt for it, or so that I would govern the Church and save it from the present difficulties, but so that I might suffer something for the Church, and so give proof that He, and no other, guides and saves it." Henceforth, the Pope had already abdicated his authority de facto. Rather than removing errors and heretics from the midst of the faithful, the Vatican stuck its head in the sand, notably in liturgical matters. Many priests did whatever they liked in the matter of liturgy. Initiatives taken without authorization had gone out of control. The Pope often yielded against his better inclination. In this manner, the French bishops illegally imposed communion in the hand and then spread the practice by force throughout the Catholic world. With the phobia of authority typical of liberals, Paul VI found it much more convenient to place the government of the Church in other hands. The reorganization of the pontifical curia had put all of the Roman congregations under the control of the Secretary of the State, who henceforth had the power to act as the true leader, with the Pope as a figurehead. If we have analyzed accurately the historical facts of the pontificate of Paul VI, repeated under John Paul II, we might draw the following conclusion. Since the publication of Humanae Vitae, the Pope has not used his power of infallibility to rule on an open question of faith or morals, considering that he no longer has the strength to oppose the decisions of the powerful bishops' conferences. What is true for orthodox teaching is true a fortiori for heterodox teaching. This conclusion alone destroys one of the principal arguments used by the Sedevacantists. Number 4. The abandonment of the primacy of Jesus Christ and of the Church. After the primacy of truth and of the Pope, Rome consciously abandoned the primacy of Jesus Christ, King of society. The gulf separating St. Pius X from Paul VI might be expressed by two passages of Holy Scripture on the reign of Christ. Ignoring the marching orders of St. Pius X, "Restore all things in Christ," the Church began contrariwise to echo the cries of the Jews during the Passion. "We do not want him to reign over us," effectively repudiating the kingdom of Christ on earth. The politics of Rome has consisted in suppressing the last of the Catholic states, content to see the Church granted the same rights as all religions. After Spain, Colombia, and certain Swiss cantons, came Italy's turn. As early as 1976, Paul VI began preparing the Treaty of 1984, abrogating the article by which Italy recognized the Catholic religion as the sole religion of the state. Paul VI asked only that the Catholic Church be recognized as a form of religious expression, which had played an important role in the history of Italy, and nothing more. Such an abdication of the primacy of Christ, the King over society, opened the door to the secularism now rampant in these once Christian countries. Divorce and abortion, by the unilateral decision of the state, and catechism no longer obligatory in schools. How could we pass in silence over Rome's betrayal of the Catholics living under a communist regime, such as when Paul VI deprived Cardinal Minzenzi of his functions as primate of Hungary to please the local authorities, such as when he showed his sympathy toward the schismatic Catholic Church of China, condemned by Pius XII in 1956, such as when he visited Colombia in support of the campesinos and indirectly the guerrilleros, such as when he embraced the KGB agent Athenagoras by lifting his excommunication, such as when numerous official meetings took place between Casaroli and the Soviet government, each one advancing the communist cause. The persecuted Catholics are still waiting to see the tangible fruits of this near-sighted Ostpolitik. Finally, Paul VI abandoned the primacy of the Catholic Church, outside of which absolutely no one is saved. The ecumenical spirit of the Council was manifest in two different ways: by a despoiling of the riches of the Church, and by the scandalous overtures made to heretics. As for the riches of the Church, we refer above all to the Holy Mass and to the consecrated life. The Mass is the heart of the Christian life. It was pulverized by the arrival of the new Mass, as Annibale Bugini, the architect of the Novus Ordo Missae, cynically declared. The Pope, in an allocution to members of the Concilium, which included 6 non-Catholic observers, reproached the Council of Trent with having obscured a more ancient tradition. Jean Guiton shed light on the mindset of his illustrious friend. Paul VI had the ecumenical intention to remove, or at least to underplay anything in the Mass, which might be too Catholic in the traditional sense of the word, in order to draw the Catholic Mass closer to the Calvinist Mass. With such a criterion, we can understand why the Institutio Generalis gives a Protestant definition of the Mass. The Lord's Supper or Mass is the holy assembly, synaxis, or meeting of the people of God, gathered together under the presidency of a priest to celebrate the memorial of the Lord, according to the promise of Christ. Wherever 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, I am there in their midst. Matthew 18:20. The new Mass is equivocal because it casts doubt on the nature of the priest, seen here as the animator of the crowd, on the Mass as a sacrificial act, reduced to a simple commemoration, a proposition condemned by the Council of Trent, and on the real presence, denied by the Protestants. This ambiguity is affirmed from all sides. From the side of the Catholics, Cardinals Ottaviani and Bacci immediately wrote to tell the Pope that the Novus Ordo Missae marked a significant departure, both as a whole and in its details, from the Catholic theology of the Mass as it was formulated at the 22nd session of the Council of Trent, which, in establishing definitively the canons of the rite, erected an insurmountable barrier against any heresy aimed at damaging the integrity of the mystery. From the Protestant side, Max Thurian of Taizé declared, "One of the fruits of the liturgical reform will perhaps be that non-Catholic communities will be able to celebrate the Holy Supper with the same prayers as used by the Catholic Church. Theologically, it is possible." The same was clearly not the case with the traditional rite. M. Sigwald, professor of dogmatic theology at the Protestant University of Strasbourg, also commented, along with other Protestants, that nothing in the Mass so renewed could really trouble an evangelical Christian. It remains to be seen whether such a rite could still be called a Catholic Mass. The same vandalism which tore apart our Mass has also paralyzed the consecrated life. Priests are naturally the first victims of the ecumenical Mass. There is an unprecedented crisis in the priesthood at the present time, not so much because the defections have attained unimaginable proportions, or because they have been legalized on so large a scale, but because the priests themselves seem to deny their sacred character. The priest has lost his identity, in the same way the conciliar hurricane brought with it a spirit of democracy, which has wrought chaos in the religious life. After the council, every one of the religious institutions had to call an extraordinary general chapter to rewrite its constitutions and rules. St. Padre Pio did not mince words when he heard of such innovations. "Now what are you doing in Rome? What are you scheming? You even want to change the rule of St. Francis?" True, religious reforms have always moved from something lax or easy towards something more difficult. In this case, the ruling principle was the spirit of independence. Religious set about destroying the authority of the superior general in favor of a democratic assembly. They laid waste to the enclosure and monastic stability. They destroyed community life in order to be each one in his each oneness. Above all, they lost the spirit of consecration to the service of God in favor of a consecration to the service of man, or worse yet, to the service of humanity. Cardinal Danilou himself evoked a state of religious decadence. The statistics are there, indisputable. In the 10 years after the council, the Church lost a quarter of all her religious, with recruitment near zero. The moral disarray of the modernist Church, its spiritual, intellectual, and moral license, is obviously not the ideal climate for inspiring generous souls. The forces of the Church were neutralized by Paul VI, but never so radically as when he was pursuing his chief obsession, ecumenism at any price. The abandonment of the primacy of the Catholic Church suddenly appeared in all its gravity in the lifting of the excommunication of the schismatic Eastern churches, without requiring the least abjuration, and the handing over of the papal ring to Ramsay, a layman, a Freemason, and a heretic, who proceeded to give his blessing at the Pope's side, in the promulgation of the decree on Eucharistic hospitality towards Protestants, and the Pope's concelebrating with Anglican pastors at the Vatican, and his offering the Muslims the flag of Lepanto, and his dropping the requirement that children of mixed marriage receive baptism. This Pope had the ecumenical itch, a veritable ecumenia, desperate to gather all churches and religions into one. Had he ever read the ancient oath, sworn during the papal coronation, which stipulates, "If ever I betray the tradition received from my predecessors, God will not be a merciful judge at the last judgment"? Alas, Paul VI did not follow the wise counsel of St. Pius X. This last had rightfully taught that truth does not want to be concealed, but unfurled like a flag. Only by honesty and sincerity can we do any good, even if it means attracting the attention of the enemy and drawing down his attack. In spite of his natural optimism, on December 7, 1968, Paul VI confessed his anguish before the conciliar disaster. The Church is in a disturbed period of self-criticism, or what would be better called self-demolition. It is an acute and complicated upheaval, which nobody would have expected after the Council. It is almost as if the Church were attacking herself. The Pope's own words revealed the source of the evil, but he refused to see it. He took up the same tone on June 29, 1972. From somewhere or other, the smoke of Satan has entered the temple of God. Doubt, uncertainty, issues, anxiety, dissatisfaction have all appeared. What happened? We confide to you our thought on the matter. Some adverse power, the devil, that mysterious being, enemy of all men, that supernatural something, came to spoil and dry up the fruits of the ecumenical council. Truly, the devil would not have been able to do much at all in the Church if an anti-church had not already been in place. Freemasonry, certainly, with its unacknowledged Satanism, but also and above all their henchmen in the Church herself, who opened wide the gates. Now it is difficult to deny that Paul VI, in the footsteps of John the 23rd, maintained friendships with secret societies. Montini, before 1950, reportedly predicted to Father Morlion that a generation would not pass before peace had been established between the two societies. We have already spoken of the Cardinal Bea's numerous meetings with the B'nai B'rith of New York, with such consequences for the conciliar decree Nostra Aetate. The Pope followed and encouraged these meetings, some of them public, with high Freemasonic dignitaries in view of reaching an ecumenical public agreement between the Church and Freemasonry. We might also evoke the unconditional support granted to organizations of a Freemasonic bent, such as the United Nations. If the facts which we have reported are indeed historical and confirmed by the evidence of a continuing labor to demolish the values of the Church, then the reader will understand our anguish at reading the discourse of Paul VI for the closing of the council. He professed an immense sympathy with the anti-church, ultimately the Church of Lucifer. The religion of God, who became man, has met the religion, for such it is, of man who makes himself God. And what happened? Was there a clash, a battle, a condemnation? There could have been, but there was none. The old story of the Samaritan has been the model of the spirituality of the council. A feeling of boundless sympathy has permeated the whole of it. This text, already revealing for the council itself, is particularly significant for our study, for it gives us the key to deciphering the enigmatic pontificate of an equally enigmatic pope. Tragically, did not Paul VI serve the religion of man becoming God, more than the religion of God made man?